Situation as the players and part of the commentary team head off to get some refreshment. But Jarrod is alongside me here. The art of batting, it's taken you about 2.5 years to write. You've been talking to me about it, we've spoken about it. Where to start? I'll tell you where we'll start. We'll start with a couple of questions. Actually, I'll start with a question here. We've had some through on the talkSPORT Cricket YouTube channel chat facility. Smithy. Sergeant Smithy 100. Question for Jarrod. So, obviously, you've got 50 batters in here. But he asks, who did you really want to include, but in the end, you couldn't justify it?
I mean, I think there's probably about 3 or 4 players that I was a bit disappointed didn't quite make the final list. I think Graham Gooch would be quite high up there. David Gower's probably another one, and there's some very good older players as well that were probably unlucky. But the main player for me is Adam Gilchrist. He was the one that I couldn't quite justify, and the reason I couldn't justify it is I think the median score he came into bat on, John, was something like 230 for 5, which is probably higher than most teams were scoring around the era that he played. He played in a great batting era, and he was the only number 7 I even looked at. Right, everyone else was a top 6 player, and I really wanted Gilchrist in, but I just didn't think it was fair to the other guys who were doing harder jobs than him and in tougher situations. I think what we really came about when we were doing the list was there's probably 37 automatic greats, and then what you have from there is about another 30 to 40 players who have a claim to greatness. And then, so you get very subjective on the last 12 to 13 players. And so, yeah, Gilchrist is for me. I think both of my researchers who work with me, they both wanted Gilchrist in, and I had the final say. And Gilly's out, John. Gilly's out.
Well, he is. I mean, do you make any? I mean, look, these guys are all batters only, really, apart from Andy Flower, Kumar Sangakkara,
there's
A.B. de Villiers.
Yeah, Walcott, Sobers, and Callis. And
so there are
maybe if you want to count Steve Waugh, because he would have been an all-rounder if his hamstrings had remained attached to his body.
So you wouldn't almost, you know, how good is it? It's impossible to know, isn't it? Essentially, we don't know how good. In another world, when he doesn't keep wicket and he bats higher up the order, then Gilchrist might actually be in the list. Yeah,
but, I mean, if you listen to Gilchrist, he kind of said that having wicket-keeping as his second skill allowed him to play the way he did. So it's a bit of a catch-22. I think you have to factor it in. It's interesting. Generally, what happens is, I think it's when Walcott and when Kumar Sangakkara take the gloves off, they start making a lot of runs. And I think the same thing happens to Brendan McCullum. He's not in the list, but he's another player where that happens to. But the one player who takes the gloves during their prime is A.B. de Villiers, and he ends up having the best batting average of any wicketkeeper ever. So I think we can get a little bit too fascinated with that. The one player that I thought was the most important when it came down to that was Sobers, because Sobers bowls basically the same amount of balls per game as Jimmy Anderson does. Now, not all of them were seam. He bowled quite a bit of spin as well. But he had the similar kind of workload to Jimmy Anderson, and also batted down the order because they wanted to rest him. So he was probably a player that I factored that into more, and some of the others maybe a little bit less so. But that's the sort of thing you go to. I mean, a lot of this list is nitpicking on levels of greatness, right? As I said, there's 37 guys who are automatic in this list. You know, I think Inzamam ul-Haq is about 37, 38 on the list. Anyone in front of him, and him included, it's like you can't make any claim that this wasn't one of the greatest batters of all time.
So there's a couple of names that really jump out when I look at, say, the top 20. Len Hutton at 4 and Ken Barrington at 17.
Yeah.
So I would expect...
Oh, wait, I just realised now that this is going to be a Surrey thing, isn't it? You're going to go on and on about Surrey again.
No, what I'm going to say is, I'm surprised both of them as high as they are. And one of the reasons for that is, I think Ken Barrington is hardly ever mentioned, or very, very rarely mentioned, when great England batters are brought into discussion. And here he is, just 4 places behind Joe Root. And as you say, Graham Gooch isn't there, and he is 9 places ahead of Geoffrey Boycott. Why do you think Ken Barrington doesn't get the love in this country that your book suggests he should?
Yeah, if you look at most people when they do these lists, he's usually in the top 10. So I've actually probably moved him a little bit
Really?
lower. Yeah, and it's because he almost averages 60.
Yeah, going on average alone.
Yeah, and
but
most people just do average, and we obviously went well beyond just average.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second.
But I think with Ken Barrington, he does play in a lot of high-scoring matches. He doesn't go up against a lot of great bowling attacks. But I went and looked at footage of him. I listened to people. I talked to people who played with and against him, and everyone was like, it's funny that you mentioned him with Hutton, because they're very closely remembered, whereas essentially what people said about both of them was they never made mistakes. So they weren't exciting to watch. You know, they weren't dramatic players in the way that some of the other batters on this list were, but they didn't make any mistakes, and so you had to get them out. And with Barrington, I think when he played for your lot, he only averaged about 42, I think, for Surrey. And when he played in Test cricket, he averaged high 50s. So I think his Test average is probably slightly it's higher than it probably deserves to be if we look at his overall talent. But he made so many runs, John, and he also had to deal with mental health issues during his career. I've always thought he was quite underestimated. I think people who love history of cricket probably think I have him too low. People who don't know anything about history of cricket probably think I have him a bit high.
So, apart from just looking at the averages of all these guys, what else did you look at to enable you to come up with what seems like a pretty definitive answer to the question that you posed yourself? Yeah.
So what we did was I started with looking for batters who had averaged over 44 and made more than 3,000 Test runs. We changed that occasionally for special cases like W.G. Grace and Ranji and Victor Trumper. And then we realized there weren't any openers on the list, so we had to open it back up to make sure that a third of the batters on the list were openers. So the cutoff point for the openers was 42, so a little bit lower. Then what we did is we compared them all against each other, and we also compared every player to the era that they batted in. So how much better were they than everyone else in their era? And also, how much better were they than the other players in their games? So the other batters, the other top 6 players that they went up against. In some cases, the West Indies of the 1950s and 60s and, India of the early 2000s, it's quite tough on someone like Sachin Tendulkar because he's got Rahul Dravid and VVS Laxman and Virender Sehwag also in his team. But that's the kind of thing that we did. We then had a look at everyone's home record, their away record, and then we got into real nitty-gritty stuff about strike rates, where we could find strike rates for some of the older players. But the really fascinating things was looking at who were the best bowling attacks they went up against, and did they make any runs? So Walcott and Weeks, who are very famous for having these huge high batting averages, when you start to dissect their batting, it doesn't quite stand up in the way that a lot of the other great players do. And so they were moved further down. And so you're looking at all that sort of stuff. Also, what position you batted. You talk about Len Hutton. He has an incredible batting average and almost no mistake and no issues in his record at all. And he was batting at the top in English conditions when it was really tough to do so. So we're trying to factor all those things in, and then there are probably some intangibles there. I would say KP is probably higher than some people would have him in the list because of his ability to change a game so quickly. Victor Trumper and Javed Miandad are maybe slightly higher because they actually had a lasting impact on the game. They changed how people batted. Right, so little things like that I think also played a part, and looking at simple things like, did you make runs in all 4 innings, or did you just make runs in one particular innings that you were really good at? If you're an opening batter and you were sent in to bat, did you make runs when you were sent in to bat? Right? Did you make runs in New Zealand, South Africa, and what's the other one? New Zealand and England against the new ball? All these sorts of things. So we start to get to the point where I've got like a file on each one of these batters, and in it, I can look them up and go, okay, so here's their strengths, here's their weaknesses, here's why we really like them, here's why they might need to be a little bit lower, and here's the question marks. There were some great players who, like Tom Bradman, doesn't even play all the way through his peak years because of the war, and so you have to factor all those things in.
When you came to writing this book and you thought to yourself, okay, well, who are the top 50 batters? And you think of Sachin and Lara, and you think of whoever, right? Did you just think, well, it's obviously Don Bradman not one, and then I'll work out the rest? And when you came to that, if you came to that conclusion, was the gap between first and second actually smaller, larger, or pretty much where you thought it was going to be between Bradman at 1 and Sachin at 2?
What I really did was I figured that Bradman was going to be number 1, so I almost put him to the side for a minute, right?
Yeah.
In fact, it's so funny. As I said before, I compare all the players to the other greats. And Bradman is he's so far ahead on every single metric anyway. It just makes everyone else look silly. But what I really wanted to do is see if another player, or in this case, another couple of players, also had a case to be number 1. And so we ended up with 3 players that we thought had a genuine case to be number 1, which is Don Bradman, Sachin Tendulkar, and Jack Hobbs, right? Those are the 3 players that we thought had genuine cases to be number 1. Then it was a comparison thing at that point of, does Sachin's career or Jack Hobbs' career have enough strengths in it to be able to overcome what Bradman did? And one of the interesting thing with Hobbs and Sachin is how long their careers are. They're so much longer, and so that's something that was in their went in their way. But the thing is that in their back half of both of those guys' careers, they are still in the best 3 or 4 best batters in the world, but they're not the best batter in the world. Whereas Don Bradman was the best batter in the world from his second Test match till his last Test match.
Wow, that is a stat.
And so, do you know what I mean? And like people will say things like young people get really upset. And they're like, oh, but he was playing against farmers and accountants and whatever. And I was like, so was everyone else. And the second best batter of his era, he still averaged 40% more than. Not the other batters in his era, John. The second best batter in his era. And you can find periods where Sachin and Hobbs were elite and we're not far away. I think there's one period in Hobbs' career before World War I where he has Bradman-like numbers, right? But do you know when Bradman had Bradman-like numbers? All the way through his career. So the 2 things that bring Bradman back towards Sachin and Hobbs is probably the fact that he wasn't very good on wet wickets, which was something that you had to deal with in the uncovered days. And I think he averages something around, I can't remember, it's in the book, but maybe 15 or 16 on wet wickets. But that meant he averaged 120 on normal wickets, John. And the other one was he wasn't particularly good when bodyline happened and they bowled bounces to him, but he still averaged 50 in that series. Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you compare that? And I think Sachin's record is fascinating. Jack Hobbs' record is fascinating, but they're not quite at that level. But I think you can make a claim that they could be a number 1. It just happens to be that if you have a look at what I've got the range of the players.
Well,
right?
I was going to ask you about the range.
Yeah. So if you go back to the first page, to the page with the number 1s on.
I'll just show our viewers.
Yeah.
See there, it says, I don't know if you can't see that, it says range. Alongside
there's nothing
the
better
ranking, the player name, the country of origin,
and the tier.
It says range.
Yeah, so we've got tier and range. So the tier is essentially what you're doing with the tier is you are putting a player, you're saying that you might have a player of, we didn't end up using it. It's in the actual chapter itself, where in the tier, what it says is we've got 4 players between, let's say, 26 and 22. I can't split them. If you were to come to me and say this player should be 22 and this player should be 26, I'd be like, that's probably fair.
Yeah.
And that's where the range comes back in. So for the range, we're looking at, I think there's a player at the...
So if someone comes to you and says Don Bradman should be number 3, the range is Don Bradman is 1.
There is nowhere else he could be on this list.
But
right?
for Jack Hobbs, say, if someone comes to you and says, well, I think Sachin should be behind Jack Hobbs, or maybe, or Jack Hobbs and Len Hutton switch out, you can... If you want to hear the argument, you can maybe make a case for it.
It's the back end of the top 10, I think, is really interesting because you've got Sunil Gavaskar is 5 to 10, Viv Richards is 7 to 13, Garfield Sobers is 5 to 12, and Callis is 4 to 12, and Wally Hammond is 4 to 14. Any of those players can kind of jump around depending on the case that you're making for them, right? Yeah. And so I didn't want to say this is the 50 best batter. Like, it'd be silly for me to say to you, John, how dare you say that Jarrod Kimber is not the 22nd best batter of all time? Yeah. That's a ridiculous thing to say, right? But what you can say is roughly he should be around that area, and you can make a claim that he might be a little bit higher or a little bit lower. And then you have some players like W.G. Grace and George Headley and Victor Trump, but they have huge ranges because they didn't play as much cricket. We don't have as much information on them, right? And so you're trying to, at that stage, you have to be honest with yourself and go, this is not a list from up on high. The aliens have not come up with some sort of AI technology to tell us exactly who the top 50 batters are. We have to understand that you will look at the game slightly differently than I will, and the range is, I think, an attempt from my point to sort of understand that there is those differences. And as you can see, you've got Hobbs can be anywhere from 1 to 3, whereas I've got Sachin can only be anywhere from 1 to 2. So that meant that Hobbs kind of had to be behind Sachin at that point, And as you said, Don Bradman is number 1, and there's no other player who could be in that top 3. I haven't put anyone else in that range who could be that high, where there is quite a few players on my list who could be as high as 4.